Look at a map of the Western Pacific and you'll notice something most people never think about. The South China Sea is not a sea. It's a corridor, a highway, a pressure point. It sits between the factories of East Asia and the consumers of the world, between the energy producers of the Middle East and the industrial heart of China, Japan, and Korea. It is the kind of geography that decides the fate of empires quietly, without speeches, without elections, without morality plays. And over the last decade, what happened there wasn't a series of random provocations. It was not just nationalism. It was not just island building. It was a deliberate attempt to rewrite the military geometry of the Pacific. China didn't only want to expand its presence, it wanted to change the cost of American power, to turn the region from an open ocean where U.S. carriers could roam freely into a contested zone where every mile forward feels like walking deeper into a minefield. This is the part most commentary gets wrong. People saw the dredgers. They saw the sand. They saw the runways. They saw the flags. They treated it like political theater, like Beijing was playing for leverage at the negotiating table. But what if the table was never the point? What if the islands were only the visible scaffolding of a much larger weapon, one built not on the surface but beneath it? Because when you're dealing with great power competition, you can't start with personalities. You start with structure. The international system has no referee, no global police, no higher authority that guarantees security. In that environment, survival becomes the first law, and power becomes the most reliable currency. Every major state learns the same lesson eventually. If you don't shape your region will shape you. China's rise made that lesson unavoidable. As its economy expanded, it ran straight into a classic great power dilemma. The stronger you become, the more you depend on what you cannot control. Sea lanes, choke points, foreign technology, distant energy supplies, and the military presence of a dominant power sitting right off your coast. From Beijing's perspective, the United States was not simply a rival. It was a gatekeeper, a navy that could appear in China's near seas at will, an alliance network wrapped around the first island chain, a surveillance system in the sky, and a fleet of carrier strike groups that represented the ultimate symbol of a world where American power could touch any shoreline. So China asked a brutally practical question. If the United States can bring carriers to our backyard, can we make that too expensive to do? Not forever, not everywhere, just here, in the decisive space, in the waters that matter most. That's the logic of what I'm calling China's submarine wall, a layered defensive perimeter designed to deny the United States freedom of movement in the Western Pacific. A wall that doesn't look like a wall because most of it is invisible. A wall built out of sensors, missiles, geography, and underwater stealth. And it began to take its modern form around 2013, when the island-building campaign accelerated. Fiery Cross, Subi, Mischief, names that sound like distant rocks but became something else. Unsinkable platforms, fixed airfields, radar nodes, missile sites, logistics hubs. People call them aircraft carriers. That's partly true, but the deeper function was more strategic than cinematic. These islands helped extend China's eyes and reach across the sea. They pushed surveillance outward. They provided forward positions for aircraft and ships. And most importantly, they created overlapping zones of coverage so that any force entering the region would be seen, tracked, and targeted earlier. But the islands weren't the real blade. They were the handle. The blade was under the water. Because in modern naval warfare, the most valuable piece on the board is the aircraft carrier. It's not just a ship. It's a moving air base. It's deterrence. It's diplomacy. It's a promise to allies. And for decades, American carriers operated with a kind of confidence that shaped the entire post-World War II order in the Pacific. China didn't need to sink carriers to win the strategic argument. It only needed to make carrier commanders hesitate, to inject doubt, to create a region where moving closer feels like gambling tens of billions of dollars and thousands of lives against weapons you can't see. Submarines do that better than anything else on Earth. And this is where the South China Sea becomes the perfect hunting ground. It's not a simple open ocean. It's messy. It's filled with reefs, islands, thermal layers, shallow shelves, deep basins, background noise, and maritime traffic. In other words, it's a sanctuary for stealth, a place where submarines can hide, maneuver, and wait. So while the world stared at runways and radar domes, China invested in what really changes the math. An expanding submarine force, increasingly quiet platforms, better sonar, improved torpedoes and cruise missiles, and the ability to build at scale. In estimates often cited by analysts, China's submarine fleet has grown to dozens of boats, with ambitions for more. But here's the key point. Quantity matters, yes, but quality changes everything. Early Chinese submarines were often described as loud and trackable, but newer generations reduced noise, improved sensors, and narrowed the gap enough to create real uncertainty. And in naval war, uncertainty is lethal, because a carrier group doesn't fear what it knows, it fears what it can't confirm. One submarine in the right place can paralyze an entire formation, not because it will definitely strike, but because it might. A single modern submarine, with the right weapon, can threaten a ship worth more than the GDP of small countries. That's the asymmetric advantage. That's why undersea power is the great equalizer. It allows a rising power to challenge a dominant navy without matching it ship for ship. And China didn't rely on submarines alone. It stacked layers. It built a system. Above the sea, airfields, patrol aircraft, drones, radar networks. On land, long-range anti-ship missiles designed to reach out into the ocean. Under the sea, submarines and sensors forming a screen, turning the region into a contested zone. This is what the Pentagon calls anti-access/area denial, A2AD. But that label makes it sound technical, like a doctrine in a binder. In reality, it's a political weapon. It's a message delivered through physics. You can come here, but you will pay. And here's the twist that makes the whole thing so dangerous. From Beijing's perspective, this can be framed as defensive. China can claim it's protecting its claims, securing its near seas, preventing encirclement, and deterring what it sees as American intrusion thousands of miles from U.S. shores. But from Washington's perspective, it looks offensive. It looks like an attempt to push the United States out of a region where U.S. alliances, trade routes, and credibility have anchored the balance of power for generations. That's not ideology. That's the security dilemma, the oldest trap in great power politics. One side builds defenses to feel safe. The other side feels threatened. Then it responds, and the spiral tightens. So, as China's undersea bastion grew, the United States didn't shrug. It adjusted. It invested in new concepts for operating in contested environments. It strengthened partnerships. It increased cooperation with Japan and Australia. It expanded the architecture of coalitions, arrangements meant to ensure that if the Western Pacific becomes contested, the U.S. is not alone. And every American move, every new exercise, every new partnership confirmed Chinese fears that the United States intends to contain China indefinitely. That is how you slide toward conflict without either side wanting war. Because war doesn't begin with desire. It begins with incentives. It begins when both sides believe time is running against them and hesitation is more dangerous than action. And that brings us to the real heart of the story. The South China Sea is not the final battlefield. It's the preparation space, the testing ground, the place where China learned how to raise the cost of American intervention. The real prize, the strategic keystone, is Taiwan, because Taiwan is not only an island, it's the central link in the first island chain. It sits in the position that can either block China's access to the Pacific or open the door for it. And if China can make American power projection uncertain in the seas around Taiwan, it changes the credibility of deterrence itself. So the question isn't whether China built islands. The question is, did China build a system that makes the United States hesitate when Taiwan becomes the focus? Because if hesitation enters that equation, everything changes. Now, we get to the part that turns China's submarine wall from a regional military project into a historical turning point. Because once you accept what this wall is designed to do, raise the cost of American intervention, the question becomes unavoidable. What happens to deterrence when the strongest navy on Earth can no longer move freely? Deterrence isn't a speech. It isn't a press conference. It's a belief inside the mind of your opponent that you can and will act fast enough, hard enough, and close enough to matter. For decades, the United States could create that belief with one simple fact. Carrier strike groups could surge into the Western Pacific and operate with confidence. That confidence was the backbone of every security guarantee, every alliance commitment, every "we will defend" statement. China's submarine wall targets that confidence directly. And here's how it works at the strategic level. You don't have to defeat the U.S. Navy in open combat to win the political objective. You only have to make the decision to intervene, feel uncertain, slow, and catastrophically expensive. If American planners believe a Taiwan contingency could cost multiple capital ships, thousands of casualties, and a risk of escalation into a wider war, then the U.S. response becomes less automatic, more conditional, more delayed. In other words, you don't remove American power. You inject doubt into American power. And doubt is contagious. Because the moment Washington starts thinking in terms of can we and at what cost, allies start thinking too. Japan, the Philippines, Australia. Even partners who are not formal allies like Singapore or Vietnam begin to hedge. They may move closer to the U.S. in public, but they also maintain economic and diplomatic options with China, not because they love Beijing, because they fear being trapped on the wrong side of a future reality. This is how regional orders shift, not through conquest first, but through credibility erosion. Now apply that to Taiwan. Taiwan sits in the center of the first island chain, the arc running from Japan down through Taiwan to the Philippines. Strategically, it functions like a gate. If China controls that gate, its navy gains a cleaner pathway into the broader Pacific. If China does not control it, China remains partially boxed in by geography and by the network of U.S.-aligned states that sit along that chain. This is why Taiwan is not just an island, it's an operating position, a hinge in the map. So from Beijing's perspective, Taiwan represents unfinished business and a strategic necessity. And from Washington's perspective, Taiwan represents a line that cannot easily be crossed without collapsing the entire structure of American influence in Asia. That is why Taiwan becomes the stress test of the submarine wall. Because if China can make the waters around Taiwan too dangerous for carriers, it changes the balance of local military power. And once local power shifts, political timelines shift too. Here's the uncomfortable logic. A rising power often believes there is a window, an opening, when conditions are most favorable to settle a core issue before the balance shifts again. China's military modernization is changing the regional balance, but it also creates urgency. Because China's planners know the U.S. is not static, the U.S. adapts. It builds new weapons, it reorganizes, it strengthens partnerships, it moves production, it fields new systems. So the race becomes psychological as much as it is material. A race between China's perception of closing opportunity and America's ability to restore credible deterrence. And that is where miscalculation lives. Because each side reads the other's defensive preparations as offensive intent. China sees alliance networks and patrols as encirclement. The U.S. sees island militarization and undersea expansion as preparations for coercion or invasion. Both can be simultaneously rational and simultaneously wrong about the other's true threshold for war. That's the trap. Now, zoom out. China's submarine wall is not just submarines, it's an ecosystem. Undersea screening matters, but it becomes far deadlier when paired with long-range missiles, air defense, and sensors. The wall doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to create layered problems for U.S. forces. Problems that compound. Imagine an American carrier group approaching. It has to worry about, first, being detected early by radar and surveillance from islands and aircraft. Second, being targeted by long-range anti-ship missiles fired from the mainland, systems designed to reach hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. Third, being tracked by submarines waiting in the noisy, complex waters of the South China Sea and surrounding approaches. Fourth, having its communications disrupted, its satellites jammed, its networks attacked, and its decision cycles slowed. Each layer does not need to guarantee a kill. Each layer only needs to increase risk enough to slow operations. And in a Taiwan scenario, time is everything. Taiwan could face a rapid fait accompli, an attempt to change facts on the ground before outside powers can respond effectively. This is why A2AD is not just a military concept. It's a time machine. It can compress the timeline in favor of the attacker by delaying the defender. And that's when deterrence breaks. Because deterrence depends on quick, credible intervention. If intervention arrives late, it becomes a choice between escalation and acceptance. And that's exactly the fork in the road China's strategy is designed to create. Now think about alliance politics under this pressure. Japan imports critical energy and relies heavily on sea lanes. The Philippines sits near key routes and has deep strategic geography. Australia is far but essential as a rear base and logistics anchor. South Korea is complicated, tied economically to China but security linked to the U.S. Singapore is the ultimate balancing case, a trade-dependent hub that wants stability above all and cannot afford to fully alienate either side. In this environment, countries don't choose sides once. They choose every day. Through access rights, port visits, basing agreements, joint exercises, procurement decisions, diplomatic statements, trade deals, and China's wall pressures those daily choices. Because if China can credibly threaten the maritime lifelines, it gains leverage without firing a shot. It makes regional states factor Beijing's preferences into their decision-making, quietly, pragmatically. This is where the military and economic layers converge. The South China Sea is one of the world's most important maritime corridors. If you control the conditions of transit, if you can monitor, intimidate, or potentially interdict, you gain strategic leverage that is larger than the sea itself. It becomes influence over trade flows, energy routes, supply chains, and the cost of doing business. And influence over economics becomes influence over politics. That's why the submarine wall is really the military foundation of a broader regional order, a world in which China sits closer to the center of gravity and the U.S. must operate from farther away with higher costs and greater uncertainty. But here's the critical point. This doesn't end the competition. It transforms it. Once China makes the near seas contested, the U.S. shifts to bypass strategies. It invests in long-range strike from outside the contested zone. It disperses forces. It builds smaller, harder-to-target platforms. It leans on submarines of its own, unmanned systems, and anti-submarine warfare improvements. It upgrades logistics. It turns to distributed basing and access agreements. So the game becomes, China pushes outward with layered denial. The U.S. tries to regain operational freedom without triggering escalation. And that's where the risk rises. Because contested zones create constant friction. More patrols, more intercepts, more close encounters, more chances for an accident, a collision, a misread radar lock, a pilot making a split-second decision. In stable eras, a single incident becomes a headline and fades. In tense eras, a single incident becomes a test of credibility. If you back down, you look weak. If you escalate, you risk war. That's how crises begin. Now add technology, because modern great power rivalry doesn't stay on the sea. China's strategy increasingly depends on information. Satellites for tracking, networks for command and control, cyber for disruption, sensors for detection. The U.S. depends on the same. And that means the submarine wall is tied to a second wall in space and a third wall in cyberspace. If satellites are blinded, targeting becomes harder. If networks are disrupted, coordination collapses. If undersea sensors are compromised, submarines regain advantage. If quantum sensing or advanced detection becomes real, the entire balance of undersea stealth could shift. So both sides now race in domains that multiply uncertainty, and uncertainty again increases the risk of miscalculation, which brings us to the harshest conclusion. China's submarine wall is defensive in form, but it can be offensive in effect, not because it invades anyone by itself, but because it changes the incentive structure around Taiwan. It can create a moment where Beijing believes the U.S. cannot intervene decisively, and that belief can tempt action. And the United States sees that temptation, which is why it responds, which is why China accelerates, which is why the cycle tightens. In Part 3, we're going to finish the story by stepping back even further. What this means for the global order after 1945, how anti-access strategies spread to other powers, why the Pacific is entering a new era of contested naval dominance, and what a submarine wall world looks like when multiple regions start building their own. Step back far enough, and you realize China's submarine wall is not only about the South China Sea and not even only about Taiwan. It's about the end of an era. Because since 1945, the global order, especially in the Pacific, rested on one assumption that almost nobody questioned: the United States could move freely across the world's oceans. American naval supremacy wasn't just military dominance. It was the invisible infrastructure behind trade security, alliance credibility, and the idea that any major act of aggression could be punished quickly by overwhelming force arriving from the sea. That assumption is now being challenged, not by a single battle, but by geometry, by systems, by layered denial, by the slow construction of regional fortresses that don't need to conquer the ocean, only to contest it. And that's what makes the submarine wall historically important. It shows a rising power doesn't have to match the hegemon everywhere. It only has to dominate the decisive zone. The logic is brutally efficient. Instead of trying to build a navy to beat America on the high seas, China built a strategy to make the high seas irrelevant near China's shores. It used geography like a weapon. It used asymmetric cost curves. It created conditions where the U.S. Navy, the most expensive instrument of power projection ever built, faces the most dangerous environment possible. A place where every approach is watched, every move is tracked, every platform is inside overlapping threat rings. In great power competition, that is a victory even without firing a shot, because it shifts the baseline reality that everyone else must adapt to. And adaptation is the real story of the next decade. The United States has already begun adjusting to this new world, not by abandoning the Pacific, but by redesigning how it fights there. The future American approach is less about a few massive platforms moving confidently forward, and more about dispersed forces, long-range strike, and survivability through distribution. Instead of concentrating power into a handful of carriers, the U.S. aims to spread power across many nodes. Instead of operating close, it aims to strike from farther away. Instead of relying on uncontested information, it plans for degraded communications, jamming, and cyber disruption. Instead of assuming safe logistics, it prepares for contested supply lines. This is what happens when a hegemon loses freedom of movement. It doesn't collapse overnight. It becomes more cautious, more complex, and more expensive. And that is the hidden cost China imposes. Even if the United States can still win a war, the price of maintaining the ability to win rises dramatically. More spending, more risk, more alliance management, more diplomatic friction, more constant readiness. Now zoom out again, because China is not the only state learning this lesson. The submarine wall is part of a global trend, the spread of anti-access strategies among regional powers. The reason is simple. It works. A2AD is the poor man's answer to a rich man's navy. You don't need to match aircraft carriers with aircraft carriers. You match them with missiles, submarines, mines, drones, and sensors. You weaponize the coastline. You turn nearby seas into danger zones. You force the superior navy to operate from a distance where its power is diluted. That logic shows up in other regions. In the Persian Gulf, the threat is not a blue water fleet. It's a dense, dangerous environment full of missiles, mines, fast boats, and coastal defenses designed to make American naval operations risky and politically costly. In Eastern Europe, the pattern appears on land. Layered defenses, missiles, electronic warfare, and geography used to constrain NATO options, raise costs, and slow response timelines. In Northeast Asia, the presence of missiles and nuclear capabilities changes the calculus even further, turning speed and escalation management into the decisive variables. This is the world we are moving into, a world where multiple regions become contested bubbles, where intervention is possible but not free, and where crises become more dangerous because the margin for error shrinks. And the deeper danger is not just war, it's misinterpretation. Because when both sides build defensive systems that the other side interprets as offensive, you get a spiral driven by fear, not intention. China fears encirclement, so it expands denial. The U.S. fears coercion, so it strengthens alliances and forward posture. China sees that as containment, so it accelerates. The U.S. sees that acceleration as preparation for aggression, so it responds again. At no point does either side need to want war. They only need to believe that backing down now creates a worse war later. That is how great power rivalry turns into great power conflict, by turning time into a weapon. And that brings us to the final point. The submarine wall doesn't settle the competition. It intensifies it by shifting it into new domains. Because if the near seas become too dangerous for surface fleets, the competition moves to undersea dominance, who can detect and kill submarines first. Space control, who can preserve satellites, disrupt the enemy's satellites, and maintain targeting. Cyber and networks, who can blind, confuse, or paralyze the other side's command systems. Industrial capacity, who can build weapons, drones, ships, and munitions at scale in a long conflict. Technology leadership, AI, semiconductors, sensing, autonomy, quantum research, all shaping who sees first and strikes first. This is why the submarine wall is not only a military barrier. It's the physical symbol of a broader reality.